Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and if you grow dahlias and you've been wanting to reduce your workload, you're going to want to watch today's video. Let's go. I've been growing dahlias now on a production scale for 7 years. 7 years? 2018? 7 years. And that means I grow around 1,000 dahlias. In general, they're not the best cutting flower. Now, that being said, I still grow them because we do weddings, we do retail, and people love dahlias. For U-picks, people love dahlias. But here in my zone 5, 6, we are supposed to be digging them up every year. So dahlias are native to Mexico, actually, which explains why in colder zones, more northern hemisphere, we have to dig them up every winter, because otherwise, if those dahlia tubers freeze in the ground, they turn to mush, they don't come back. So typically, flower farmers dig them, gardeners dig them if you're in a zone 8 or colder, so zones 1 through 8. When I first started growing dahlias, I dug them all up. In fact, I still have videos on my channel where I show digging them up, curing them, and all of that stuff. Now, my zone is pretty dry, so what I always had trouble with was balancing humidity. So keeping them from rotting and yet keeping them from not shriveling up and drying out. So every year, despite all of my best efforts and doing everything right, storing in cardboard, storing in bags, storing in containers, we tried it all. I still would always lose around 30% of my tubers every storage season. So not only was it a lot of work in fall digging up 1,000 tubers, especially in clay soil. If you have clay soil, you know how hard it is to dig up those tubers, and then wasting all the water, trying to wash them off. Eventually, then I started just using an air compressor to blow the dirt off, but still, it was a lot of work. And quite frankly, there are other things that I would much rather be doing in the fall, like putting a cover crop down that will be more helpful for my garden. When I was digging my dahlias and I ran the numbers on how much time I was spending on planting and digging and dividing and et cetera, the dahlias were not as profitable. So I had to come up with a way to help make them more profitable. And I saw at the time that Martha Stewart was talking about winterizing and overwintering her dahlias. So I said, well, if she's able to do it, I should be able to do it too. So I started doing this 4 years ago. It is now year 4 that I have been doing this. And in fact, my first winter doing this was the coldest winter that we'd had on records for about 30 years. So it was a really good experiment year because it was a very cold year. We had a week where we didn't get above the negative Fahrenheit temperatures. So I knew if they could get through that winter, then it would be successful. You can see there's one row behind me that I've already winterized. It has a tarp over the top. This is actually a silage tarp. It's the same one I reuse every year. Obviously, I would prefer to use something that's non-plastic, but on this scale, it's a little bit difficult to find a tarp that's the right size. It's not plastic-based. At home, you could use a sheet of plywood or something to that effect. We'll talk about all these details, but first I'm going to talk about pros and cons of overwintering them in the ground versus digging and dividing. So digging and dividing versus overwintering, mostly obviously what we're talking about is time. So we're saving a lot of time by not digging these up in the fall. Also, I find that they sprout earlier in the spring. So when we're leaving them in the ground, they tend to come back earlier. I get earlier blooms. This year, I actually had my first dahlias in early July, which is pretty much a record for me. Usually it's the end of July that I start getting my dahlias. So that was great to have those earlier on. They do also multiply underground. That can be a pro because they do get bigger and healthier, but it can also be a con because if your dahlia tubers underground get too big and too crowded, then that can actually negatively impact their ability to bloom. So this is why I say you can still dig them up in the spring. Now I don't, because let me tell you what happens for me. What happens for me is that the dahlias, because I have clay soil, I plant my dahlias a little bit more shallowly, so only about 2 inches below the surface of the soil. What happens throughout the summer is they grow their little clump, they extend their tubers and they turn into a clump. Some of those clumps go a little deeper, some are a little bit closer to the surface. What I find when I'm overwintering is that some of those tubers a little bit closer to the surface actually die off on their own because they do tend to get a little bit more exposed to the cold temperatures closer to the surface. So some of them freeze off, and what I'm left with are those lower level tubers. So I actually have not been digging and dividing them every year unless I want to multiply my dahlias. So this is another pro-con situation of not digging in the fall, is that you're not able to really get a good idea of what your stock looks like for the next year. So if you're trying to extend your dahlia area, whether it's a farm or a garden, you might want to know in the fall how many you will have heading into spring. Now, of course, you can still have losses like we do over the winter. Even if you know how many you have, you might not have that many in the spring because some die off in storage. But in general, you'll have a good idea. So compare that with what I do if I want to divide. If I feel like I need to multiply my stock or I want to sell some, then I dig them up in spring. So I actually do that, and I dig them up just before they're about to sprout. So I'll kind of keep an eye on, the weather. I'll keep digging away and pulling away the mulch throughout the spring. I'll talk about that too in a minute. And I'll check and see, okay, have they sprouted yet? And I'll dig a little bit until I can find one and see if they've eyed up. Once that ground is, so really for me, my last frost is around mid-May. So usually I'm doing that around mid-April, where I'm starting to dig them up and do any division, and then I just immediately replant them back into the ground. I don't store them inside at all. Oh, another con of not digging them is if you have a young stock. So say you just started growing dahlias, and a lot of them, you might not know whether they have disease or not. So digging them and really looking at them is one of the best ways to know if they have things like leafy gall or crown gall. And so digging them up can be really helpful, especially those first couple years while you're going through your supply and you're culling them and seeing which ones are healthy and not, because you don't want to leave one in the ground if it has a virus. So the pro con, right, of not being able to divide them in the fall is, it depends how you look at it. You can still divide them. I just prefer to do it in spring. They've eyed up better. So in spring, the eyes are more visible. They're easier to divide in spring. And then again, I just immediately replant them or I sell them if that's what I'm doing. So no storage needed, no storage space needed. So that's a huge pro. All right, now cons obviously are that you're not sure if they're gonna survive. So if you're just starting out on this and maybe you're colder than a zone 5, I'd say this is fine down to a zone 5. If you're colder than that, just start with a few of your tubers. Don't do all of them in one winter, because if it doesn't work, then you'd lose them all. Start with just a little section, just do a few at a time. So how do we go about doing this? I'm gonna show you, this is the row behind me that I've already done. So I mentioned these ones I cut down and I already have winterized. You can see I've got my tarp on top. I've got it weighed down with some leaf bags, and I've got my leaves under here. So let's look at, and actually this is a double layered tarp. It's two-sided. It has white on one side and black on the other. I just have it folded over. Obviously the thicker your tarp, the more insulation it's going to provide. So if you are in one of those colder zones, you could add, a layer of an extra tarp. You could add a layer of frost fabric if you wanted to really ensure that they're going to survive. So what do we use for mulch? So we have two primary enemies when it comes to overwintering dahlias and things that will make that not successful. And those two things are, one, moisture, and two, cold. So number one, I say try to protect from moisture as much as possible, especially if you're in a climate that gets winter precipitation. Even in my dry zone, I will have them rot if they're not tarped. So yes, you'll definitely want some kind of a tarp, and you'll want it to extend a little bit further from your dahlias. I'll show you when we're doing the dahlia row here, but if say this is your dahlia row, you don't want to just have the tarp sitting right on top of it. You actually want the tarp to extend a little bit out beyond the edges, because moisture can kind of wick in. So extend the tarp out a little bit further than you think. The other enemy is that cold. So I mentioned zones 5 and above, 5, 6, 7. This will work really, really well. But beyond that, what you need to think about is, am I able to keep my ground from freezing? If there's no way, it doesn't matter how much mulch you put down, if there's no way you can keep your ground from freezing, then I would not try this. So how much mulch you use will be dependent on how cold your winters get. This is why I say start with a small patch, because when in doubt, just start small. You can always add more mulch than you think you need. When in doubt, mulch it out. More mulch than you think you need. Some of this will depend on what you are using for a mulch. So what are the things that you can use for a mulch? You could use, my favorite is leaves, because there's an abundance of them in my area in the fall when I'm doing this. You could use really whatever you have on hand that's an organic material. So if you have wool on hand, you could do this with wool. You could do it with pine needles. You could do it with wood chips, but if you use wood chips, you're gonna have to clear them away in the spring. So just remember, those could be heavier. It might be a little bit more work. Straw bales you could use. If you're in a colder zone, a straw bale could be a great option. Don't even unbale it. Keep it as one whole straw bale, put it over the top, throw your tarp over that and weigh it down, and that will probably be sufficient to keep your ground from freezing. I have so much space that doing it with straw bales would be economically probably not the best idea. So I use leaves. We do a leaf donation. I put it out on Nextdoor or Facebook or Craigslist and say, hey, you can drop your leaves here. I do mention, please don't bring us any leaves that have been treated with any kind of pesticide, like for ash borer or that kind of thing. And also I also request no big sticks or branches, but I don't worry too much about, like, oh, is it black walnut or is it whatever, because this is just for mulch, and then we're gonna pull it away in the spring anyway, and then you could use those leaves to mulch, your pathways or to make leaf mold or any of those things. So I don't really worry about, the juglone in black walnut, for example, and how that can be a growth inhibitor. I don't worry about that when I'm using leaves as mulch. We are here just for dates. It is the second week of November for me. Before Thanksgiving, we have had our killing frost. Our dahlias are dead as a doornail. You could do this before your dahlias are totally died back. It kind of depends on the weather forecast. So I say wait for your ground to get nice and dry. If you have a big rain event coming up, if you tend to get a lot of fall precipitation, do this earlier than later, because you want to do it when your ground is dry. So say that heading into the end of summer, your ground is very, very dry. That would be a fine time to cut down your dahlias, even if they're still green, and go ahead and mulch them and tarp them. I've got my clippers. You could really use anything to cut the dahlias down. At this stage, it's not very efficient to use electric hedge trimmers because of the texture of these dahlia stalks. They are still a little bit moist, and so the hedge clippers just don't work all that well. I have also used my bush hog in the past to do this, which is basically like a giant lawnmower, but it can handle, thicker stems. The problem is the bush hog, I found, kind of can rip them up and out of the ground. And so then it kind of pulls the dahlia tubers up and out of the soil, and I don't want that happening. Now I am leaving a little bit of a stump here just so that in the spring I can come back and kind of look and find these tubers, because I do like to check in on them in the spring and make sure they survived. So usually, maybe around early April, I'll come in and kind of start digging around and being like, okay, are you still here? Because that way I know if I need to order more dahlia tubers or not. So having those little stumps here where I've cut is a good way for me to find them and to dig for them. Otherwise I'm just having to dig around and look for them. Okay, so I now have all of the dahlias cut down. So now I'm going to go ahead and start applying the leaves. Now, most of the leaves that have been dropped off this year are unmulched, which means they haven't been chopped up. I usually do prefer that just because the bags are lighter and easier to handle. But I do have a few bags of mulch leaves as well. I'm actually going to save those ones because they're really heavy. I'm going to use those ones to weigh down the tarp. And then in the spring, I can use those mulched leaves to make some leaf mold. But for now, I prefer the unmulched ones. Also, it's better for the pollinators to not mulch the leaves because a lot of them like to nest in there. They can be hiding out in there. So I'm just going to start dumping these leaves on. So pretty much I dump one bag and I just leave it. I don't spread it at all. Now it does naturally spread out a little bit. And again, I do want to make sure that I'm getting all the way to where the dahlias are at the edges. So you can shake it a little bit. There we go. Leaf bags are in good shape. You could save them and reuse them. You could use them, as a weed barrier in pathways for the next year or to start a new bed. Okay, last step is to get some bricks or something heavy. If you're using anything that's plastic, make sure it's UV rated. For example, our tunnel here that I used to keep our tractor in is UV rated plastic, which means it doesn't crumble. It doesn't mean it doesn't break down into microplastics. Do I hate that we have that thing? Yes, but it protects my investment of my tractor. So, and also, of course, sometimes we grow stuff in there, but not really that much anymore. Anyway, if you're using anything plastic to weigh down your tarp, just make sure it's a UV rated tarp. Again, my tarp is also UV rated. It's also not sitting in direct contact with the soil, and it's also not sitting there while it's hot. So remember that the two factors that we need for microplastic breakdown are heat and moisture. So this is why landscape fabric is so bad, because especially growing in it, because usually what we're doing is we have moisture and it's during the warm growing season, so we have a lot of plastic breakdown. This is not sitting in direct contact with the soil. It's during the cold time of year. So again, still not the best. If you could use plywood or something else, go for it. But again, you need something that's gonna keep the moisture off. Here's my other silage tarp here. I hope it doesn't have a snake in there. Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Literally right as I said that. Go on. Okay, hopefully it doesn't have another snake in there. Right, I just grabbed my tarp and I'm gonna put it over the top, trying to not disturb the leaves too much. So I'm actually gonna unfold it first. Now you're gonna want to get this tarp on as soon as possible. Don't put the leaves on and then wait even a day or two, because if there's a good breeze, these leaves are gonna be gone. So tarp it immediately. Don't even do this until you have your tarp. All right, okay, we've done it. So the last tip I'm gonna give you is, if you are in clay soil or an area that gets a lot of moisture, because we mentioned moisture is the enemy, a good idea is that when you are building your dahlia beds, you mound them a little bit. Now, you guys know I don't really do a lot of raised beds because, quite frankly, I just find it's very expensive, and buying soil, usually the soil that I buy is worse than the soil that I have. So instead of that, what I do is I just create my little mound. I'm gonna link the video below where I show how I do that. But by having the dahlias in a mounded bed, at least they won't be sitting in water. So even if this tarp happens to not fully cover the dahlias, or say there's a lot of moisture, especially in the spring, then at least they're still sitting in a mounded bed and the water will sit in the walkway, the aisle next to them. So, all right, that's it, guys. It is much simpler to do it this way. I'm going to link below part 2, which is what happens in spring. So last spring I filmed a video where I showed exactly what it looked like when I removed all of this mulch, so you can see the next step and you're prepared. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me, and I will see you guys around here next time at the farm.